Okay, hello, Zara. I'm Peter Rush. I am an author, among other things. The book we're talking about today is my novel Wild World, which, if you want to think about the title, I sort of borrowed it from a Cat Stevens song of the era, and it's set in 1970, and we'll go into more of the details of it. My background is I have had a varied background over the years. Though my writing career, I have been both a newspaper reporter and a magazine editor. I've also been a public relations executive, and the last 25 years I've been in the management business. And I've also had a few other adventures, which we can talk about a little bit later.
So you're definitely a melting pot of professions. So what inspired you to pursue writing in addition to your established career in management and the other things that you dipped your toes in, as you mentioned?
Well, actually, I started my career writing. It's what well, actually, it isn't what I really wanted. I started my career, I was planning to go to law school, but a few things came in the way. I actually, after I graduated college, I became a police officer instead of going to law school and did that for a while. And then I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in West Africa. So after that, when I came back to the United States, I was trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. I went back to graduate school, and there was a writing program at the University of Florida, and a very interesting professor who was also, I guess, what you'd call Southern Gothic, a guy by the name of Harry Cruz, who I got to know very well. And they had a lot of good visiting professors who were excellent writers. Nelson Algren, who wrote The Man with the Golden Arm, a famous one in the 50s. So I started pursuing that, and out of that graduate program, I got a job with the newspaper and pursued that. Went to the state of Kentucky and lived there for a year. Wrote for some magazines there, and then decided if I was going to be a writer, I should go to New York. So I packed up everything I owned in my Volkswagen and drove to New York without a job or a place to live, and found a job in publishing. So that was my writing career, and that's where it started. I thought I'd be successful, wrote a novel back then, got an agent, had it sent around, and it was a spectacular failure, which was actually good because I'm glad that novel was not published today under my name. Uh, so with that, I actually figured I'd better get a real job. So I started a career and had a family, and but the writing side was always there. Always wanted to do it. Always wrote in business, both creatively. Well, not so much creatively, but more journalistically. And so, probably about 5 years ago, I decided that this novel had been in my mind for many years. I had stories and ideas, and I started writing some of the scenes down. And as the scenes started coming together, then I found a thread for the book. And as it turned out, the book I'm very proud of. I mean, it won a number of awards. I was surprised about how well it was received by the critics. And now, just I'm trying to broaden the audience for people to see the book and really experience what went into it and what's made it a really good read and a good novel.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting the police too. You have a lot of experiences then. So, can you describe your purpose in writing Wild World? What are you hoping that readers are taking away when they read your work, and why should they read your book?
The book is set in 1970, okay, but it really applies to today. The story revolves around a young man uh, and his girlfriend coming of age, as you do in college, and trying to decide what are you going to do with the rest of your life. And 1970, for those of you who are not alive at that time, including my interviewer, was a time of serious a tumult in the United States. The country was extremely divided. We had a president that half the people hated and other people loved. Doesn't sound like anything we heard today. There were demonstrations in the streets. You had some new movements that were moving on right then. You had the beginning of the women's liberation movement. You had a very active civil rights movement and more radical groups like the Black Panthers and Students for Democratic Society who were planting bombs around the country, including in the US Capitol. So there were a lot of things going on. And the younger generation really didn't feel that the establishment was listening to them. So I took as a starting point an incident that happened in May of 1970 when National Guard troops were on this campus, on a number of campuses against students who were demonstrating. And they opened fire on unarmed students at a place called Kent State in Ohio, killing 4 students, injuring another 7. 2 of the students were just walking to class. They weren't even part of the demonstration. This set off a nationwide strike at the colleges. Practically every university in the country closed down, as well as a lot of high schools and other organizations. So this was the crucial, the stepping off point for the novel. Said, what's going on now? Why is that important? Well, the main protagonist has to think about what is he going to do. The country is a mess, and he meets this detective from New York City, a guy named David Dirk, who actually was a real character, who had been an Amherst graduate, and he challenges him and said, you know, you can you can complain about the system all that you want, but if you want to change it, you have to be part of it. You have to get involved. You have to do something. And that takes Steve to make a decision with his girlfriend, Roxy, to forego law school, stay in Providence, Rhode Island, and join the police force. Now, a second portion of that is he wanted to stay with Roxy, who's still an undergraduate, and she's got a whole backstory about why it would be tough for him to leave her at that point. So there's a love aspect to it, but he had to make a decision. And that's one of the things that happens in life. You have to make decisions. And then once you've made that decision, you have to live with it, or you have to deal with the consequences of that decision. And that's where the launching point of the book is, and why the novel really explores the decision-making process and how it affects him, affects the people around him, affects his relationship with Roxy, affects his relationship with the police.
Sounds like a vital theme. So there's a lot of parallels between 1970s and now. Was that a conscious choice on your part?
When I was writing it, no. As I was finishing it, I realized how much there was. And it was a very, very interesting, especially as people read it, and when it came out, a number of the reviewers caught on that right away, that the parallels were so strong, and that the types of decisions that the current generation were making, college, was the same kind of decisions that you had to make back then. What you're going to do, just protest and then go away, or are you going to try to do something about it? And if you did try to do something about it, it's not simple. It's messy. It's complicated. It's painful. But in the end, you have to do what's right. You have to be true to yourself.
Yeah. So I think we've touched on this already a little bit, but why did you choose 70s as the era for your novel?
Well, as I say, it was a crucial point, turning point in the country. Not to say that everything happened at that point. Nixon was reelected in 72 by an overwhelming landslide, even though, but 2 years later, he was gone because of Watergate and the fact that Tricky Dicky finally got caught. But it did change the trajectory of a number of things in the country and made a whole generation much more aware of it. One of the things in the book, and for those of you who are interested in it, many of you are, is the theme of music. So I said Wild World is a Cat Stevens song from the time, and many of you may know it. Oh, baby, baby, it's a wild world. But each chapter actually takes a theme from music that is contemporary to the action that's going on there. So, Teach Your Children, Four Dead in Ohio, All Along the Watchtower, both sides now. Those who are interested in it, actually, there's a Spotify list on my website. And it was interesting while I was writing the book. I listened to an awful lot of music from the era, and it really put me in the mood. And I think a lot of people still like music from that era.
Yeah. So Wild World isn't your only book. You definitely have a lot of different work. So is Wild World a standalone, or are you trying to build a collection from with all your works, even though they're from different eras?
Well, my second book, which is called Young Americans, which is more of a crime novel, actually picks up one of the characters out of this book, Tommy, which is the younger brother of Steve, who is into sort of low-level marijuana dealing, which is something else that was going on in the early 70s. Now you can go to the store and buy it, but back then you had to know somebody. And his progression through. Actually, I've used the Young American title because that's the title of a David Bowie song, if you don't know it. So that's part of that collection. And actually, I'm working on a third novel right now, which will bring back Roxy and Steve 10 years later, and how far they've come and how much they've changed in a very, very, let's say, life and death situation. I'm not going to give you more to that because I'm having a little bit of struggle with this one. I know the story, I just got to keep writing it.
Well, I'm sure people will be eagerly awaiting that. So, as far as Wild World goes, what is your favorite scene, story, or aspect of the novel?
Well, the there's several pieces that are very crucial to me. One is the relationship between Roxy and Steve. Roxy's a very strong character. She starts out at 18, so she's young. By the time it's over, she's 20, and she's gone through that maturation from high school to college, at the same time going through the whole women's liberation and I am strong, I don't need you, I didn't come to college to find a husband, which is Steve is saying, well, we could get married now that I'm employed. And she goes, no, I didn't come to college to find a husband. She wants to be a doctor. At that point and you probably don't realize, is less than 10% of the doctors were women. So women becoming doctors was very unusual. And there's a scene in there which I talk about how far we've come is that there were no women on the Supreme Court. There were no women police officers. Most of the lawyers were men. And if you look at it today, 50% of the women in law school are, no, 50% of the people in law school are women. Same in medical school. In veterinary school, 70% are women. So it's a huge change over that period. But there is an interesting scene where Roxy is at home. They share an apartment, and again, a college apartment with a couple of other roommates. Yeah, maybe a little marijuana hanging around, and the police send a couple of officers to the apartment just to check on Steve. And Steve isn't there, but Roxy is. And Roxy is angry, petrified, angry at Steve that she has to go through this. And Steve asks her, what did they ask? why, what did they know? I need to know everything. And then he says, was the apartment clean? Meaning, was there any pot around? And Roxy says, no, there wasn't any pot around. Clean? That's debatable. College apartments? Clean? That's debatable. So that was a good scene. There's some tense scenes later on with the police because Steve is not accepted. So as he's moving through his journey, is a line I've used. Steve finds out that making a difference is making him different. So he's no longer really, he's not as trusted as much by his college friends anymore, because now he's gone over to the dark side. But he's not accepted by the police because they see him as an outsider, as a college kid. So he's sort of caught in this in-between place without a lot of people to go. And at the same time, his relationship with Roxy begins to fray. So there he is out on an island, having to make his own decisions and try to make the best ones he can.
I think you picked a good name for Roxy. It gives that strong, like spunky personality there. So transitioning a little bit off Wild World and more to your journey as an author, how has your formal education translated to your writing, and maybe even your upbringing and your experiences, maybe as a police officer and in your other fields of work? How have they all influenced your writing?
I've always been a reader, started very early on. Actually, my father was a high school English teacher. And I always enjoyed good literature. I spent a lot, I've always read. And if you can see behind me, there's a few books in my library. And these are only the ones I decided to keep, not all the other ones I've read. But I always thought that the written word is a important way to express ideas that will continue. A text message is there and gone. But writing, especially long form, where you have to sustain an idea and develop an idea and build upon an idea, is a challenge. It requires thought. It requires a fair amount of discipline. I can say that I've written many different types of forms, from straight expository. In college, I wrote a lot of thesis, a lot of papers, and in journalism, you had to write on deadline. Okay, need the story in half an hour, and you better get it because you got no choice. So I think, from my standpoint, my education is very broad. My undergraduate degree was in international relations. So I've studied economics, history. I'm a big history buff. But I also think it all comes into coalescing into a giving something to the reader and bringing a lot of these pieces in, let's say, effortlessly. So if you read, and one of the things people have talked about, if you read Wild World, there is a lot of history in that book, but it doesn't hit you over the head. Okay, there are pieces in it. Pieces are accurate. What happened, what people said, reference points. So I think that's important to try to incorporate that into it. I think my own feeling about writing is, you become a writer by writing. You can't do it any other way. And it doesn't always have to be good. I mean, I have lots and lots of notebooks of things that I've written that are certainly not publishable. But it doesn't mean that I didn't help trying to express myself. So my different experience has been important. So, for instance, when I was in Peace Corps, I was in a remote village in West Africa, and we didn't have telephone, we didn't have telegraph, we didn't have electricity. So the only way I communicated with people was by writing to them. And it was funny because it would lag sometimes by a month. So whatever I wrote today, they didn't get a month from now. So you learn to appreciate. You appreciated when that letter showed up, because it was one of the few forms of communication. So I think it's really my feeling about my own journey has been that, I hopefully have a couple good novels left. I've got a couple other ideas that I want to get out there. But it's also trying to capture a time and place for people so that at some point in the future, someone, or even today, people who are not allowed who are not alive can experience something of what we felt back then.
Yeah, I've been raised and bottle fed instant gratification like as long as I can remember. So it's weird to think about like slowing down and taking like time to write, as you said, long writing where you're sustaining a thought. So moving more into your like balancing your personal life and writing career, how are you able to balance all of your different professional pursuits and writing?
I will say that the challenge was finding the time. Okay. And the time became a discipline issue for me. So what I was doing, I would get up early. I like to write in the morning. I would get up early. I'd try to write for an hour or two before going to work, which meant generally getting up by 5 because I usually would leave. Lived outside New York City, so I'd have to take a train into the city. So I would try to leave my house by around 7 and to get to work by 8:30 and work till the end. So the morning times were my writing times. I traveled a lot. My management business was international, so I traveled a fair amount. So I tried to use time on planes and in my hotel rooms. And I'll tell you, a memorable one. I was in London. I had a meeting one day, and then there was sort of an off day, and then I had another meeting the following day. And that off day was one of those rainy, ugly days in London. And I spent the entire day in my room writing, not doing anything else, not going outside. Didn't even have lunch that day. I don't think we came up for dinner and wrote a real chunk of the book. And then another time I had to go to Boston. I was in Cambridge, and I had a meeting canceled. Guy got sick, and so I had a day. So I could have gone and hung around Boston, but instead I stayed in my room, and I had a whole bunch of edits to do, and I re-edited the whole section of the book. And that's one of the things that you find the time if you want to do it. If it's important to you, you find the time. It's almost like anything else. Is if you really want to do it, you will find the time, because there are a lot of things that you do that are really not that important that consume your time. Oh, let me check my text messages. No, you don't really have to. You could wait a couple hours if you just want to concentrate. Turn off the phone.
Yeah, so I think you're kind of touching on this already right now, but what is your advice for aspiring writers hoping to write their own book?
I will say, don't give up. I mean, that's the biggest one. As I said, I wrote a novel when I first came to New York and got an agent, and I was like on the top of the world. And I still have the pile of rejection letters I got from all the major publishing houses. And the second go round, of course, getting agents today is pretty impossible because the publishing industry has really changed into being a blockbuster industry, sort of like the movie industry. Can we do the same thing 4, 5, 6 times until we run out of steam? Then we have to find something else. But I think finding a voice is important. Being able to express yourself, and I am one who is a strong believer in rewriting and editing. I am not somebody who expects my first draft to come out crystal clear and perfect. In fact, Wild World went through numerous versions before it was something that I felt comfortable with. And I would tell an aspiring writer, if you are not in a writing group, go get yourself into a writing group. It's good to get some criticism, some feedback. One of the hardest things for a writer is not connecting with an audience, not understanding what they're hearing from what you're writing. Um, at the point where you feel that you have something that's really solid, go get a professional editor and get good feedbacks from an editor. So the woman who was my editor on Wild World, somebody I've never met. We just communicated by writing back to each other. And her criticisms of what I was doing, what I was saying, what I was not saying, was was fascinating. And things that you overlooked, or things that you didn't think were important, and she says, "Boy, that's great." So getting that is really important. I mean, all writers want to be praised, but you got to take a lot of criticism, and you got to be able to take that criticism positively, improve your product. So it's like anything else. You can always polish a little bit more. I come from a journalism background, so I'm not a flowery writer. I am one who likes to get to the point, get the declarative sentences, um, try to help the reader move the story along. I like the story to keep moving, keep the page turning. Want you to know what the next page is. Want you to know what you to want to know what the next page is. And I think that's a good point for any writer. A trick that I learned many years ago from a writer friend, which is good for most writers: stop writing in the middle of a scene. Because when you're ready to start writing again, you can pick up the idea and get started again, as opposed to stopping at the end of a chapter, because then there's a lot more momentum, a lot harder to get the momentum started again. That was a trick I learned many, many years ago from a writer friend of mine. And the other one, and I think every writer goes through it. There's always doubt. There's always a challenge of starting with a blank page. The enemy of a writer is a blank page. Put it down. You can always throw it away. I won't tell you, there's a scene that I wrote for Wild World, which I loved. I really captured something that I really wanted to talk about, because it was about, anyhow, it's made the cutting room floor. It never made the book. Okay, even though I loved the scene, but it just didn't work. So I had to cut it out. So that's one of those things you have to do as a writer, and that's why having a good editor helps. But you have to be unafraid. I mean, one of the things about I think it was an Ernest Hemingway quote: "Writing is very easy. You just sit down at in his case, a typewriter, and bleed." Okay, so it's like, yes, it's there's a challenge, but certainly computers make it easier than a typewriter. But the answer is stay with it, challenge yourself. Some writers like to put a deadline of how many pages they're going to do a day. I'm not that kind of writer. I'm also not somebody who is. There's a thing of either planner or pantser. I don't know if you've ever heard those terms. A planner is somebody who does a whole outline and then writes from there. A pantser writes by the seat of their pants, whatever comes up. That's where the story goes. I have somewhat of an outline, but I tend to write more in scenes. And though I have an idea how the scenes fit together, sometimes it takes a little while to pull them all back through with a common thread. I try to work out of characters, and I think it's important, if you want to look at as you develop characters, think about them as people that you know. Okay, you have to get to know them well, and not just the cardboard cutout. What makes them tick, what makes them different, what makes them unique. In my second novel, in Young Americans, my I can't say villain, but my the main foil for my character is an absolutely memorable character. Everybody who's read it said, "Wow, he's really somebody I'd love to meet." Maybe I wouldn't love to meet him, but boy, what a great con man he was. So anyhow, you got to develop characters that are memorable, and by doing it, it's the little things that make them memorable. So stay with it. And as I say, it took me a long time to get my first novel published. It didn't take me that long to get the second one done. It hopefully won't take me that long to get the third one. So once you get into it, okay, you really you put the time in and the effort, and you'll be successful.
Well, it's definitely a lot of good advice and a lot of good specific tips. So, those are all the questions that I had for you, but is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Yeah, as I said, is there are lots of different ways that a theme can come to you. So I said, the idea of the music theme with Wild World uh, came to me sort of left-handed. Is I was trying to write about this era, and somebody said to me, "Well, what kind of music did you listen to back then?" I went, "Oh, Jews, wait a minute, I got some of those albums." And then I started doing a little Googling as to what other songs were there that same time frame. And then I put together a whole, playlist. And I started listening to some old albums, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Rod Stewart, Cat Stevens, the Grateful Dead, some of the early Rolling Stone stuff. So all this stuff was going on. And then I went, whoa, this is really important to the whole time frame. And then that moved into sort of a thematic piece underneath the book itself, which was, you'll see a lot of musical references. And actually, if you go back and look at some of the lyrics to some of those songs and put it against what's going on in the book, you'll see that there are a lot of challenges, a lot of things that have some similarities. So it's a fun read. It's a love story. There's a mystery to it, and there's a fair amount of action. So hopefully, love to hear from anybody. I have a website, www.petersrush.com. It does have a Spotify playlist on it. It has some Q&As, and it's got some background information for anybody more interested in it. But I really look forward to hearing from people.
That's perfect. You guys can look at that in the video description later. I'll put those links in there. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And for those of you who are watching the interview, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Zara. Bye.
Oh, I'm going to stop the recording.